Okay, good morning, everybody. For those of you who were not in session 302 yesterday, that's terrible. You missed a great time. For those of you who were, you already know who I am, but I'll introduce myself again. My name is Mahadeo Sukhai. I'm CNIB's Head of Research and Chief Accessibility Officer. It is my pleasure to be co-presenting this morning with you, along with Ashley, and I will let Ashley introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me well? All right, so my name is Ashley Shaw, and I am a strategic writer and accessible community engagement coordinator at CNIB Foundation. And so one of the cool things that I get to do is do some work for Mahadeo on the research team around some of our employment research.
Excellent. So just a bit of a housekeeping thing before we actually get started this morning, and it's this. The live stream doesn't pick up your questions because there are no floor mics. And so what I need you to do is speak loudly and slowly, and then one of us, Ashley or myself, will repeat your question. And we're not doing this as a delaying tactic. We're doing this so that everyone on live stream can participate fully. And so that would be good. It really is funny that there's literally like nobody within my direct visual field, which is like the 2 or 3 tables at the very front. There's only like a handful of people. The room's empty, Ashley. And the laughter tells me otherwise. But anyway, so we're going to chat with you today about employment, mental health, and accessibility solutions. And we're going to start with a story, okay? I'm going to tell you a story about a person named Joel. Joel is 28 years old. He's a job seeker. He lives with sight loss. He's partially sighted. Joel grew up in a neighborhood next door to his best friend, Jennifer, who is fully sighted. They went to the same elementary school. They went to the same high school. In high school, Joel took a little bit longer. He took an extra year or so before he graduated. Then he did what is euphemistically called by blind or partially sighted youth a victory lap, which is a term that you know isn't necessarily used in journal articles and professional educational spaces, but a lot of youth with sight loss will actually do this. So they'll graduate and go back. And so Joel took an extra year to finish, then took a victory lap one more time just to make sure and gain some additional confidence. And so he graduates then high school at the age of 20. He doesn't graduate at the age of 18. He graduates at the age of 20. Then he does something else. He takes a year off. So now he's taken a year off. He's 21 years old. When he decides that he's going to go to college. Now, his best friend, Jennifer, who grew up right next door to him, went to the same high school that Joel did. They've been friends since they were like, 5 in kindergarten. And Jennifer, because of her birthday, actually graduates high school not when she's 18, but when she's 17. So she's a tiny bit younger than Joel, but not substantially. So she graduates a year younger just because of how the artificial math works out within the education system. She goes on to a college diploma at her local college. She's interested in doing something. She does it in 2 years. And so by 19 years old, she's done. Now Joel hasn't done that as yet. At the age of 19, he's still in high school. He starts college when he's 21, and he does what every disability services office person tells you to do in the college and university space, which is feel free to take your time. And so Joel does in 4 years what Jennifer did in 2. And so he does take his time, and there's good reason for that with respect to accessible format educational materials and with respect to cognitive load and cognitive capacity within sort of what Joel's doing and the involvement within the student experience and co-ops and internships and so on and so forth. In any case, he's done when he's 25. Right? Now, by the time he's 25, he has been in college for 4 years. He's got less opportunity to engage in some of the internship kinds of spaces that Jennifer's done. He's got less employment experience than Jennifer did when she finished her program, and she finished 6 years before he did. Okay? So our 2 best friends have started to diverge very, very radically. And so Joel spends the next 3 years looking for a job. And so although he completes his college diploma when he's 25, he's looking for a job. He's 28 now, so it's been 3 years. Jennifer's been in the workforce for 9 years, and he's not as yet sort of cracked that space, okay? And so he's been living alone, he's been living with his parents, you know, kind of like in the basement of his parents' home. And so he's hanging out in the basement, and he's volunteering and he's searching for jobs online. So those of you who were here yesterday will know that the employment rate of people who are Joel's age, if you're blind or partially sighted, is about 49%. 42% of the population is actually doing what Joel is doing, which is looking for work. And so he's been looking for work for 3 years. He's been volunteering, you know, perhaps even with CNIB. So far, nothing's come up job-related. So Joel's frustrated. He's got a lack of experience on his resume. He's got this fact that his volunteering hasn't led to paid employment. And there's also this issue of the inaccessibility of many job applications and the low number of callbacks that he gets for interviews, right? So people don't really want to talk to Joel. And the fact that people don't really want to talk to Joel is compounding things, because people will talk to you if you've got experience. If you don't have experience, they won't talk to you. If they don't talk to you, you don't get experience. It's a vicious little cycle. So during the couple of interviews he's had, employers will express doubts about his ability to perform job duties because of his sight loss. He is an avid cane user, and this has negatively impacted his self-confidence. So when he walks into a job interview, because he's a cane user and he uses the cane quite well because his O&M instructors, any O&M instructors in the room? No O&M instructors in the room. Wow, that's okay, fair enough. I was going to say yay to the O&M instructors and have a rousing cheer, but I can't do that because they're not here. We can do it anyway. It's captured on video. Yay to the O&M instructors. There we go. That's the spirit. So he's a cane user. He walks into the interviews using his cane, and he doesn't have to disclose now because his cane discloses for him. Right? So there's no disclosure after you get the job. There is, I'm a cane user, let's talk about this in the interview, right? So he's run into that particular barrier because his cane discloses for him. Joel feels that his sight loss is the reason that he's being overlooked by employers because he thinks he's qualified. Jennifer's gone on and gotten, you know, several jobs. She's 9 years in the workforce by this point. And Jennifer's also decided, you know what? She's going to start adult relationships. She's going to start moving out on her own. She's going to get her own place. She's going to get a cat. You know, she's going to socialize with other people in the workforce. And so Joel's childhood best friend disappears on him, not because she's being malicious, but because she is, as they say today, adulting. Right? Joel's not adulting. Joel's still at home. Joe's still with his parents. And so he continues to be frustrated. He feels there's little that he can do to change his situation. More of his friends, not just Jennifer, have moved away from home. They've got several years of work experience. And like I said, he's lost touch with Jennifer since her wedding, the same year that he graduated from college. So she's been married for 3 years in, like I said, stable adult relationship. She's a homeowner. She's got her own space. She's got her own partner. And Joel's sort of left on the side of the road, or the side of the basement, as you were. Put yourself in Joel's shoes. I want you to put yourself in Joel's shoes. That's the goal today. Put yourself in Joel's shoes. And just a quick, really loud, very clear, very distinct, we'll repeat this. What do you think Joel is feeling? Okay, hold on. I heard depressed, I heard discouraged, I heard isolated. Ashley, did you hear anything else?
Those were the same ones I heard.
Anything else? Okay, frustrated. That's a gimme, because that was up there and I said it 3 times.
Inadequate. I think I heard irrelevant.
What else?
Forgotten.
What else?
Low self-esteem. Misperceived or misunderstood, maybe.
Yeah. Okay, those are all really good. So we've set that up. I'm going to pass this over to Ashley to set up how we're going to talk about this problem today.
So I have experienced some of the elements from this hypothetical little story that we made up for you today, and others are just elements that I've observed other people experiencing. And I really wanted to understand, I started off wanting to understand a whole bunch of things, and I had to kind of narrow it down a little bit because, we only have access to so much information right now, because this is sort of a newer research space for us. So I wanted to better understand the interactions between blindness and mental health for both job seekers and employees. And we also wanted to better understand how our interventions, so in spaces such as CNIB and other kind of, or vision loss rehabilitation, any of these sort of assistance or advocacy or rehabilitation spaces, how those interventions can promote strong mental health and positive employment outcomes for people who are blind and partially sighted. So my theory was that these are all linked up. Your blindness and your employment are related to one another. Your employment and your mental health outcomes are related to one another, and it's all just a big kind of tangle. And so I had some key questions, and some of them are, how do blindness, mental health, and employment impact one another? How do blindness and transition to adulthood impact employment outcomes? And I used a literature review to explore the existing research on blindness and mental health, as well as blindness and employment outcomes. So there was not a great deal of content in the existing research literature on the mental health of employees who are blind and partially sighted, or of job seekers who are blind and partially sighted. And so, but we do have some information that kind of helps us to understand the timeline that people like Joel go through, and how those, we know some things about people's education and employment outcomes, and that helps us to understand their mental health a little bit better. So Mahadeo is going to talk about some of the statistics that we do know.
Okay, so what we're drawing from here to support Ashley's literature review is work that we did in the International Levels of Employment study, and I threw some of those numbers at you already earlier, a few minutes ago. We also did earlier this year an educational outcomes study, which I would have actually loved to talk with you guys about, but that was one of a number of really good abstracts that were submitted to this conference, that one maybe next year. And so we're using some of those data to inform this as well, and we're also using some of the work that the research team has been doing to access data from the Canadian Survey on Disability. So some of the statistics that will back up and support what Ashley's going to talk about come from a few different sources of work that we've done over the past year and a half or so. So I'm going to start with saying that seeing disabilities, what we euphemistically call blindness and partial sight, are often compounded with lived experience of other disabilities in youth and young adults. So I'm going to throw out something, and it's going to be a bit shocking. 85% of people who live with sight loss also live with at least one other lived experience with disability. 85%. 6 out of every 7. I heard wow. Anybody else want to react to that statement? Wow. Wow again. Thank you, David. 1.52 million Canadians live with sight loss. 6 out of every 7, you're looking at about 1.25 million people, thereabouts. That's a lot of people, okay? So in youth and young adults, the other lived experiences could be learning disabilities, could be mental health issues, could be developmental neurodiversity, could also be deaf or hard of hearing, right? So when it comes to mobility and pain and some of the other things that we will look at, you'll find them perhaps more predominantly in older adults. In the younger populations, learning disabilities, mental health, developmental, and hearing loss. There's a statistic that's often thrown around The Canadian Mental Health Commission just came out with standards around campus mental health in post-secondary. A friend of mine was actually on the working group that put that together. And so 25% of students who are undergraduate or college age, 18 to 25 years old, 25% of that young adult population acknowledges mental health issues. That's 1/4 of the entire population. So this is not a small cohort that we're talking about. So young adult clients of CNIB, and some of the data that actually just came to me like midnight last night from the Canadian Survey on Disability, so I haven't stared at it as yet, actually suggests the same thing. So young adult clients of CNIB tend to have a slightly longer educational journey. And Joel's story describes that. And some elements of Joel's story may sound familiar to you as a service provider and educator, or may sound familiar to you as a person who at one point may have been, and perhaps still is, a young adult with sight loss, right? Elements of that story resonate with me for different reasons. Elements of that story resonate with Ashley. Elements of that story probably resonate with all of you. I don't need any kind of auditory confirmation of that, but I think it's a fair assumption that that will be the case, right? If you disagree, feel free to come up to us afterward and tell us why you disagree. So the high school graduation rate, right, that has been typically reported for sort of that high school graduation age space is a little bit low. It's reported as 66%. Recent data actually suggests it's a little bit higher than that. It's around 75%. The general population high school graduation rate is a lot higher. So if you're comparing the 18 to 21-year-olds, and you say, what is the high school graduation rate of an 18 to 21-year-old with sight loss versus an 18 to 21-year-old without sight loss, the difference is about 75% compared to 81%. Now, when you get older, when you say, okay, fine, let's compare the 30-year-olds. What's the high school graduation rate of a 30-year-old in Canada? It's 86%. What's the high school graduation rate of a 30-year-old who's blind or partially sighted? It's actually quite high. It pushes 90%. And so clearly we don't have a problem graduating high school. The issue is when we graduate high school. We don't necessarily graduate at the same rate as our peers. And so that's thing number one. The second thing is, again, with that young adult cohort, the post-secondary graduation rate's quite low, right? The post-secondary graduation rate is 21% if you're under the age of like 25, right? The general population post-secondary graduation rate is more than double that. It's like 60% overall across the population, right? So again, within that young adult space, you've got youth who are graduating high school later, and that is academically acceptable. And it's often encouraged from the accessible format sort of space of things and the, like I said, cognitive capacity space of things. And then we move on to university or college, and again, you're graduating later, right? So the graduation rates of, if you age match the groups, if you age match blind to partially sighted, and you age match the general population, and you say, I'm looking at the young adult up to 21 years of age, our numbers lag, right? And that's the point that I'm getting across. We have a longer educational journey. And so young adults with sight loss haven't completed their educational journeys by the time we go from young adult to working age adult. So that's a thing. Whoops, I went too far. So the working age adult population, like I said, the numbers are different, right? So high school graduation rate's quite high. It's actually higher than the general population. So we are better educated at the high school graduation level than the general population is. When it comes to post-secondary, the working age post-secondary graduation rate pushes 65%, which is, again, higher than the general population, right? And so we end up, by the time we are done our educational journeys, we actually end up better educated on average than the general Canadian population. Right? Yesterday, I was telling you some fun things about employment statistics, and so we're better educated but worse employed, right? It actually gets even more entertaining than that, and this is not on the slide, but this is something I've passed on to CNIB's philanthropy departments to use because it's a bit of a shocker. The the overall graduation rate of somebody, or sorry, the overall employment rate of somebody who is blind or partially sighted who has decided to do a PhD, a master's, or a professional degree. So, you know, think lawyer, think doctor, think nurse, think pharmacist, think social worker, think OT, think PT. And there are a lot of people who are blind or partially sighted who will go into OT, who will go into social work, who will go into counseling psych. And this is crass, but blind or partially sighted lawyers, unlike when Matt Murdock was created, are actually a dime a dozen. If we were redoing Daredevil today, we would say blind scientist, not blind lawyer. Blind scientist is still a very rare creature. Fortunately, you're chatting with one. And so if you think that population, the population that has master's, doctorate, or professional degree, the employment rate of that group of people is 55%. Do you know what the employment rate of a high school dropout is in the general population? Any guesses? Yeah, it's 70%. So think about that, right? I have a PhD, and my employment rate is actually lower than my high school dropout next door neighbor, right? That's something to stew on a little bit. So working age adults with sight loss will complete and or extend their educational journeys over time and are overall slightly better educated than the general population. So worse off employed, better educated. So that's the foundation from a statistical perspective for what Ashley's going to talk about. So we take longer to complete school, both high school and post-secondary, less likely to be accommodated in volunteering, co-op placements, internships. Those are data that we are able to infer from client stories and anecdotal perspectives. And we're also less likely to have a job. So that's the foundation. And so I'm going to let you listen to what Ashley has to say about what that means from a mental health perspective.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about mental health and blindness. So sight loss combined with low levels of perceived social support and high levels of perceived overprotection increases the risk of both anxiety and depressive symptoms. So what that means is if you have friends or family members or people in your life who are overprotective, who are kind of bubble wrapping you, who are reacting startled every time you take a misstep. They're making you very self-conscious. They're making you very anxious, and there's some depressive symptoms that goes along with that. Thanks. Perceived low social support also causes a problem in those areas, right? So this feeling that no one else around me understands what I'm going through, those sorts of things will increase depressive and anxious symptoms. The link between sight loss and depressive symptoms is interestingly stronger for working age adults than it is for older adults. And so this prompts us to ask questions about things like what is the role that education and employment outcomes play in this issue? So why is it that there are definitely concerns for older adults who are losing their sight or who are blind, but working age adults seem to be having a more difficult time in terms of their self-reported mental health struggles. Okay, so we're going to move on and we're going to talk a little bit about stigma. So can anyone tell me what, if you happen to know I guess you can see, some of you can see the slide, but does stigma mean something to you when I say that word? So some yes, some no. So stigma is it means a bunch of things to a bunch of people, but when I talk about stigma, my background is in sociology, and so I'm talking about the perspective of a social scientist, and his name is Erving Goffman, and he is one of the researchers during the 20th century who studied stigma, and he defines it as a phenomenon whereby an individual with an attribute which is deeply discredited by his or her society is rejected as a result of that attribute. And so that's been kind of the working definition for social scientists who are studying stigma for the past several decades. So now we're going to talk about what that means for the community of people who are blind and partially sighted. So when we experience stigma, there's a couple different ways we can understand that stigma and that rejection. So perceived stigma is the perception that one is devalued or treated poorly by others because of this discrediting attribute. So in the case of someone who has a disability, this will be their disability. In the case of studies that I was looking at, it was specifically participants who were blind. And so the next piece will help us understand that a bit more, and that is enacted stigma, which refers to prejudicial treatment by others. And that can be by an individual, a group, an institution, or a policy. So those are all kind of entities that can enact stigma on someone else. So if you have experienced these forms of discrimination, they can actually lead you into a weird headspace where you perceive discrimination and stigma even when they may or may not be occurring. So you start to kind of self-protect a little bit, to defend yourself a little bit, to kind of possibly misread certain situations, or just feel like you always have to be kind of on the defense. And that's what the research kind of tells us, that repeated experiences of enacted stigma can lead to an increase in perceived stigma. So when researchers were studying participants who are blind, specifically in the employment context, 83% of their participants believed that, and this was a quote that they agreed with, most employers will pass over the application of a legally blind person in favor of another applicant. So what we need to think about is, how does this belief that, I'm applying for this job, but if there's a sighted applicant, they're likely going to get hired instead. How does that belief impact the mental health of these participants? And I would also add that it would impact certain choices around, whether you're going to be a job seeker, how long are you going to spend looking for work, when are you going to enter into this kind of out of the labor force group that Mahadeo was talking about yesterday. Okay. So we're going to move on and talk a bit about locus of control. Has anyone ever heard of locus of control before? My social science people somewhere? Yeah. So locus of control is the degree to which people believe that they have control over the outcome of events in their lives, as opposed to powerful others beyond their control. So we can kind of think of it as a bit of a spectrum. So most people would be somewhere along the spectrum, as opposed to, completely at one end or the other. So the one end is internal locus of control, and this individual believes he or she has control over outcomes in his or her life. So I can make decisions. When things happen, I respond to those events, and I am kind of able to, make my own destiny. That would be something that someone believes who has high internal locus of control. External locus of control, which is at the other end of the spectrum, would be an individual who believes that life is controlled by outside factors which he or she cannot influence. So I'm, at the mercy of fate, or other people have more power than I do, and so they're able to impact my life, and there's nothing I can do about it. So external locus of control is associated with negative mental health outcomes, such as anxiety. So what you believe about how the world works and what your impact can be on the world will actually dictate how resilient you are, how you handle stress, and all these things that become really important in terms of preventing mental health problems and promoting positive mental health. In studies of college students with sight loss, there's an indication that locus of control tends to be external for this population, particularly relative to sighted controls. So it's possible that there have not been as many opportunities during childhood and adolescence to develop internal locus of control for people who are blind and partially sighted. So our sighted friends, when we're little, are developing a stronger internal locus of control through their work and play and interaction with the education system. We ourselves, as people who are blind and partially sighted, on the whole, are not. So this is a problem for us later on in terms of decisions we make and in terms of our mental health. So now that we've got these kind of thinking about these high school and college students who maybe have a bit of an external locus of control, we're just going to talk a bit about employment and transition to adulthood. So Mahadeo was talking about some of these timelines and the stats he was showing you on graduation rates. So delays in employment, which we know occur, because there are delays in the transition to employment. There are also delays in transition to independent living and the development of intimate adult relationships, because it's very hard to kind of meet people and socialize and whatever when you're living in your parents' basement. Moving out on your own or moving out with being able to have a job that allows you to get a place with friends, things like that. Those are all kind of the transition points into early adulthood. And so not being able to kind of follow this timeline with your peers or your cohort can have a negative impact on mental health, and does have a negative impact on mental health, specifically with participants who have blindness and other disabilities. Delayed graduation from secondary and post-secondary education can cause some of these problems, and these are often, as Mahadeo was talking about, caused. They're not necessarily. No one's intending to cause a problem here. There's just a lack of accommodations and resources, so it might cause you to take a reduced course load. Sometimes educators or family members or other resource professionals will not understand the impact that this can have, and their goal is just for you to have a successful educational journey. So they'll encourage you to take a reduced course load. You might get better grades, but you might be losing out on lots of opportunities. You might also have an experience where you are a student, but you really don't have time to work. So a lot of your classmates might be doing part-time jobs, things like that on the side. They're getting valuable employment experience, and we know that especially our large companies, large organizations really value these employment experiences. Self-determination and internal locus of control are associated with positive employment outcomes for young adults who are blind. So if you are, you have a strong belief in your own ability to control situations in your life, that has benefits not only for your mental health, it also benefits your transition into adulthood and through education into employment. So that's associated with better outcomes for you. So we're going to talk a little bit about another fun term from social science, self-efficacy. Is anyone familiar with self-efficacy at all? Okay, so that's exciting because that's my big kind of takeaway for everyone today. It all has to do with self-efficacy. So when we're talking about this, we're referring to an individual's belief in his or her capacity to execute behaviors that will produce specific performance outcomes. And this may be particularly beneficial for job seekers with sight loss. So self-efficacy beliefs, so your belief in your own ability to cope, your reliance on the fact that you've coped successfully in the past, things like that, these beliefs can be changed, and heightened self-efficacy beliefs are associated with empowerment and positive mental health outcomes. So if your self-efficacy is strong, which is different from self-esteem. So self-esteem is kind of talking about whether you like yourself, how you feel towards yourself. Self-efficacy is about, it's the kind of I've got this. That's my thing for self-efficacy. I've got this. I can handle it. I have resources, and when things happen in life, I know I'm able to respond, and that has dramatic impacts in a positive way on people's mental health. So we're going to talk about something called a mastery modeling program now. And this style of program is kind of a series of steps. And we're talking about something that self-efficacy is something that would be sort of intrinsically taught. So extrinsically, you might be teaching a skill. You could be teaching self-defense. You could be teaching people who are blind how to work with their guide dogs in guide dog training. You could be teaching orientation and mobility. You could be teaching job readiness skills. Whatever the program is that you're teaching, you can follow this model, and this will allow you to enhance the self-efficacy of participants in the programs. So it's very important in these programs to have an expert, and it's especially valuable. This is now me branching out into theory. So this is something that we will hopefully be able to study further in the future. So having an expert who's been where participants are before is very valuable. So having someone who is a mentor or who is a volunteer or a staff member who's also blind to work with novices is very valuable. So the expert is going to identify the skills for effective coping with whatever the situation might be. They're going to model each skill. So if they're teaching you, how to have a job interview or how to contact an employer for the first time or things like that, they're breaking the skill down into components for the novices and then modeling how to successfully move through that space. So novices will then emulate the skill, and they'll have guidance and feedback from the expert at this stage of the process. Okay, so the next component involves novices integrating skills into an overall performance, while the expert introduces mild obstacles. So you're helping people to kind of put together the bits that they've talked about. So in our career support programs, some of our come to work participants have been working on a number of skills, and at a certain point, it's important to put all these skill components together and to make sure that you can execute them on your own. The introduction of obstacles is very, very, very valuable, because experiencing something while you're in a training program is going to help you to feel like you're experiencing it while you have support. So, your hand is not being held and someone's not doing it for you, but you know that the people who are helping you and who are training you, your expert has got your back. And, so it's always valuable when the obstacles are kind of mild at first and we can talk about them afterwards. But that's ideal, and cooperative learning is also ideal, and I know that's kind of a buzz term everywhere now, but it has a great impact because participants can encourage one another and give each other tips. There's a valuable peer support aspect, and participants who are a little bit further along can actually teach participants who are a little bit newer, and so that helps to reinforce the skills for both of them and to help both of them feel like they have stronger self-confidence and self-efficacy. And so then novices will perform in realistic situations with numerous obstacles. And again, this is still valuable to have this happening during training when someone's able to give you feedback, so that by the time you're finished one of these mastery modeling programs, you have mastered whatever the skill is that you're being taught, and you're confident that you can go out into the world and execute the behaviors that you need to execute, and you know that you have the beliefs about yourself and your abilities that will help you. And we're just going to move to. So throughout all of these steps, the expert models confidence and arousal regulating techniques. So, and what that basically means is, when things go wrong, the expert is not becoming frazzled or upset. Or if they are, they're talking themselves through it. Or if participants become frazzled or upset, the expert is able to talk them through it, help them to think about the strategies they have for coping, and that way they feel like they have a handle not just on the situation when things kind of go the way that you didn't expect them to go, but they know that they have a sense of confidence in their own ability to kind of regulate their emotions and make their emotions work for them and not just, lead them around. When people realize that they have coped successfully with challenges during training, they're empowered to translate their knowledge and skills, and as well as the resources they've gathered in training, into effective coping. So that's why, these can be such valuable programs, because they can transition people from being, some of the examples I've seen this work in are self-defense, where people start out very timid, not wanting to go out at night because they don't feel safe. And, by the end, they're kind of ready to take on the world. They feel safe, they feel calm, and they know that they've handled things when they've happened in the past, and they're able to handle things moving forward. Since mastery modeling programs improve participants' self-efficacy, advocacy and employment interventions targeting youth and working-age adults with sight loss can use mastery modeling to improve mental health and employment outcomes. So there's a possibility for us to improve mental health and employment outcomes at the same time through job readiness training, but there's also the possibility that any kind of training that incorporates this type of mastery modeling will improve self-efficacy and mental health, and that by itself will have an impact on employment outcomes. So I just want to talk a little bit about some future research directions. And so this started as notes for myself, but it's kind of my call out to anyone else who's really interested in getting involved in this space in terms of research. These are the things, there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot of research that has yet to be done. And so there's a lot of questions we can't answer because of that. So I would love for us to be able to explore changes in locus of control, age and employment outcomes, as well as to evaluate psychosocial interventions for working age adults who are blind. So for example, if we run a mastery modeling program, through career support programs and things like that, to be able to assess how that actually goes, so that it's not just, Ashley's theory about, this working. We want to have actual data and say, does this work for people? If not, what changes can we make? We want to continually reevaluate what we're doing and the impact we're having. It would also be very valuable for us to have a longitudinal study exploring relationships between blindness, education, transition to adulthood, and mental health. So that's a big ask, but that's, we have lots of data that would be valuable from a study like that. That sort of follows some of our students and young adults through the cycle of education to employment from a young age. So Mahadeo is going to talk a little bit about Joel again, now that we have all that information.
All right, thank you very much, Ashley. So let's return to Joel. We've got Joel's lived experience until the point he's 28 years old, and we talked about depression. We talked about anxiety, we talked about isolation, we talked about frustration, we talked about how Joel is feeling generally given his life circumstances. And so the question is, what would you do? Put yourself in the perspective of a service provider or an educator, right? So you're a vision itinerant teacher, or you're a person who's working within CNIB Foundation or Vision Loss Rehab Canada, and so your question is, knowing what you know from this conversation that we've had up here with you, and Ashley's totally right, there's so much we don't know about the space, mostly because people haven't started thinking in the way that we've been looking at it. And putting the conceptual framework for this presentation together, we've hit upon something, and I say we, but I mean Ashley, have hit upon something that is so not thought about, that there's such an avenue here, right? We think about education in isolation. We think about employment in isolation. We know that one impacts the other, but the truth is that you can't examine employment without examining life circumstance. You can't examine education without examining life circumstance. And this is a holistic realization that we, as a world, so this isn't just anybody in particular, but we as a world just have not come to. As I said yesterday, and I've said many times when I've given presentations, as human beings, we're very reductionist. We like talking about one thing and calling it one category, and that's the end of it. And that's how our brains are wired. unfortunately, it is a tremendous disadvantage. It works great when you're on the savannah and you have to spot the lion and you focus on the lion, but it doesn't work so well in a world as complex as the one that we live in, or as a world as interconnected as the one that we live in. So let me ask you, or let both of us ask you this question: how can a job readiness program give Joel the resources to take control of his employability, improve his confidence and self-efficacy, and deal with discrimination? So what would that program look like to you? What would that program feel like to you? And although it's not on the slide, I'm going to actually ask a deeper question. How do we design things so that what Joel is experiencing never happens in the first place? So think about those two questions. We want to chat with you about those two questions for what boils down to the next 12 minutes or so. But I think it's really important to do that. Ashley, did you want to do the takeaways before we get to the discussion?
Yeah, we could do that, and that way we have all the remaining time to chat. So these are kind of just the really important things to remember. Blindness is associated with delayed transition to adulthood, which can negatively impact mental health. Blindness is also associated with experiences of stigma and discrimination, which lead to negative mental health and negative employment outcomes. So both those outcomes are negative. Blindness is associated with an external locus of control for youth and working age adults, resulting in low self-efficacy and self-confidence. And mastery modeling programs can build participants' self-efficacy, which promotes mental health and could have a positive impact on employment outcomes. Interventions to reduce the education delays for students who are blind could be developed, and other interventions could challenge the normative assumptions around desirable education and employment timelines. So what I mean by that is just that, how do we help people to graduate at the same time as their cohort, if that's what's valuable to them, and also how do we help people to tell a different story? So when they're saying I have no experience, if you've been on the planet for that long, if you're at the age that Joel is, you have some experience that it's possible, that a kind of a piece of resume software is not cataloging for you. And some of our entrepreneurs talked about how valuable that experience is this morning. So, it's not just about kind of changing the education space, but changing the way we think about our impact on the world. So both those courses of action can promote good mental health for students and for job seekers who are blind, because it's helping people to kind of take agency and autonomy over their educational and employment choices, and over how they tell their story, even that's just like through an interview or a job application. So yeah, you can, let us know what you think. Like, what do you think about our question? We want to go back to our slide about Joel.
I will put Joel's slide back up in a moment for
Sure.
those who are addicted to your retinas.
Yeah.
That's a Diane Bergeron
Yeah.
joke. I don't take credit for it, but I do use it whenever I can because it's really funny. But for those of you who are interested in contacting us about this and perhaps finding ways to help us do this kind of work going forward, Ashley's email address is very straightforward. It's ashley.shaw@cnib.ca. My email address, because of the spelling of my name, is slightly more complicated, but it's the same principle. It's mahadeo.sukhai@cnib.ca, and we would be very happy for you to reach out to us after the session. So I'm going to put the what would you do back on the slide so that again the retinally dependent can refer to the question, and let's chat. We've got about 10 minutes.